Hello. Trying something a little different this semester. I thought perhaps instead of making individual replies to your forum postings for that first Getting Started forum, that I would just make some general comments. And one reason I decided to do that was because there was an unusually vigorous and I would say articulate series of posts to that forum. I didn't feel the need to intervene and didn't want to actually inhibit the discussion in any way initially. Okay, so few general comments that may be of use later in the course. First of all, in the instructions, I ask that you distinguish between knowing and simply believing. Okay, and roughly half of you did not do that. I really feel this way, or it really seems to me, is not the same as knowing. Okay? Knowing, above all, requires that we be able to distinguish between belief and knowledge, and that means that we be able to detect and correct our own errors or improve upon our own observations. Emotionally satisfying is not a criteria of truth. People may find false beliefs to be emotionally satisfying. Consistent with experience is also not a guarantor of truth, because after all, what if your experience was different? Different individuals living at different times in different places under different circumstances may have significantly different experiences. And if you're saying, well, life has taught me this, consider if your life had been very different. If someone else with a very different life might be drawing a conclusion opposite from yours and saying, well, you know, there's one thing that life has really taught me, and here it is. Okay, perhaps a better approach would be to say that I have found it useful to approach life in this particular way. I have found it useful to guide my values or my expectations with certain principles that are consistent with my experience, which is a whole lot less ambitious than saying, well, this is one thing I know to be true. Okay? People propagate dogma by saying, yes, but you see, this is completely consistent with my experience. Well, yes, but no one of us, myself included, is the gold standard for human experience. So, now, particularly in the latter part of the course, we'll talk a lot about theory of knowledge, about distinguishing between truth and error, distinguishing between belief and knowledge. Okay, and many of you pointed out scientific beliefs or scientific conclusions as being, if you will, a good example of what you can actually say you know. Okay, now even so, let me read you something from a recent article in Scientific American. In nearly all areas of science, our evidence is imperfect or incomplete. But this is no excuse not to act on what we know. Okay, in other words, a scientist, particularly working on the cutting edge of her or his field, would say, no, we don't know everything. And yes, it is possible that some of what we think is very well evidenced will turn out to be not the best way to go, because we gather more evidence. Okay, Socrates in Plato's dialogue, the Meno, is represented as saying, you know, we can have certainty about very few things in life, but what we can have is reasonable belief, and reasonable belief is a quite sufficient guide to life. What makes a belief reasonable? One, we have evidence. Well, we can articulate clearly what it is that we do believe, and we have evidence for it. Okay, we haven't cherry picked or loaded the case for our belief. We say, taking a look at the available evidence, this is a reasonable conclusion. Now, in addition to that, you recognize that it is a belief. And because it is evidence-based, if the evidence changes, you stand ready to change your belief. A belief that is held with such conviction that it cannot be changed may not in fact be a reasonable belief at all. As we'll quote David Hume later in the course, a wise man apportions his belief according to the evidence. You weigh the reasons for believing against the reasons for doubting. Well, we'll talk about that at length later, but remember, any way we have of gathering knowledge, of separating truth from error, is a process. Philosophy is a process. Your life is a process, or can certainly be viewed that way. Science is a process. When I taught science to elementary school kids, teaching chemistry to third graders has got to be one of the best jobs that ever existed, okay, because of the sheer joy of discovery and the openness and excitement about ideas. And one young lady once said we were doing an experiment where you took a tall beaker of water and poured it into a smaller beaker that was broader to show that water simply takes the shape of whatever vessel it's in. And one young lady really thought that the amount of water had increased when she put it into a different container. And she based that on her observations. Of course, she had mismeasured, but the other kids, I mean, they were third graders, started making fun of her. And I stopped them and I said, wait, she is a real scientist because she is reporting what she observed rather than reporting what she thought she was supposed to observe. Of course, she was beaming ear to ear, for being complimented for that, but that's true. You know, you might be familiar with the notion of dry labbing. That means you didn't really do the experiment. You just figured out what results you should have gotten if everything you've been studying is correct. Well, of course, a real scientist doing real research can't simply do that, because what if the results don't come out to be what you thought they ought to be? That means that maybe some of your assumptions were wrong. Okay, now in her case, she was just mismeasuring. Okay, we always started our classes with me saying, okay, what do scientists do? They observe, they measure, they record, they repeat, they share their findings with others, and they reconsider their findings based on what others have observed. And that's the way science works. That's the way science moves forward. Okay, well, it can be said that philosophy does exactly the same thing. Okay, we are not conducting experiments. We're not in a position to predict what the physical world does. Rather, this is at the basis of, at the level of conceptual analysis. Okay? In other words, we have to have the proper tools to apply to the proper problems, and that's one way in which philosophy can inform us. Okay. Beware of inspirational sayings, okay? Because for every inspirational saying, there's another equal and opposite inspirational saying. Okay? As Weston says in his books, let the stories be stories. You can use them for their heuristic value. That is, they suggest things to think about, ways of looking at things. But understand that no point of view is the last word. Okay? Don't ossify your beliefs too quickly. Okay, that would lead to a danger of developing definite blind spots because you have an emotional commitment to only considering certain kinds of evidence. Question of objectivity was raised. Okay, we'll talk a bit about that. Most scientists, and certainly pretty much all philosophers today, would say the notion of objectivity is useful, but it's a slippery notion. Okay, objectivity, like truth, probably has to be uh, achieved as a matter of degree. Okay, there are increasing and decreasing degrees of objectivity. What does objectivity mean? It means that data has not been biased. It means that any two reasonable minds approaching the same problem should be able to arrive at the same conclusion about it. Okay, well, we'll talk about that later, particularly when we talk about the relationship between science and human knowledge. But understand, again, the process of trying to achieve objectivity or objective truth is very different from the claim to have objective truth. Okay, you're by now encountering the notion of hubris. Okay, humility will lead you to wisdom more quickly than hubris will. Okay, so one thing that I did like is that people, when they, in the responses, a general pattern is people were wary of black and white uh, dichotomies. It's either this way or it's that way. Okay, and would provide counterexamples. Well, you're saying this is generally true. Well, what about this? Isn't that an exception? Do you have to maybe modify the rule to make it less absolute? We can maybe dissolve false dilemmas by saying, rules. Actually, the notion of rule is not quite as universally applicable as our language tends to suggest. Generalizations about patterns in our observations are very different from saying this is a law. I mean, law gives a sense of inviolability. Okay, let's see. Compossibility. Compossibility comes from the words compatible and possibility. It was a term, I think, introduced by the German philosopher Leibniz, and it was used by Bertrand Russell, and particularly useful as when it comes to such things as ethics or politics or whatever. It may be possible, it may be that two different approaches, two different points of view are both possible and compatible. They can exist in the same world because they don't really contradict each other. Perhaps they're actually complementary rather than contradictory. Perhaps no one point of view is showing the whole feature. In my ethics class, we talk about distributive justice, and we note that people who view distributive justice one way tend to favor capitalism. People who view distributive justice another way tend to favor socialism. And most of the countries in the developed world are sane enough to say neither capitalism nor socialism is, the revealed holy faith. Let's figure out what actually we need to do, what actually has historically worked best, and apply that to our circumstances, rather than having some sort of quasi-religious allegiance to a particular point of view. Is it possible to have a mixed economy? Well, most economies in the developed world are mixed economies. Why am I even mentioning that? Because that's an example of compossibility. The world isn't all one way. And so sometimes different points of view are confluent in a way that is better than any one of those points of view might be by itself. I point out in my Eastern religions course that people in the West tend to think, well, when you belong to one religion, that excludes belonging to any other religion, whereas typically in China, to some degree in South Asia, in Japan, the different religious traditions are seen as complementary. If you're, when I lived in Sri Lanka, it was typically, particularly in the rural areas, People would be both Hindus and Buddhists at the same time. Well, when I want to live a better life, be a better person, I look to Buddhism. When I want rain for my crops, when I want to, try to maintain social order or whatever, I look to Hinduism. The Buddha helps me be a better person. Indra helps me grow my crops. Okay, it's complementary. It's not in competition. Typically in traditional Japan, a person would practice Buddhism, some form of Buddhism, the indigenous Shinto religion, in official capacity as far as government institutions or government rituals or so forth were involved. They would be much more Confucian. Okay, well, again, why even bother this? Can you imagine someone saying, I'm a Jew and a Christian, and I'm also a Muslim, and I find those different points of view to be complementary. It'd be very difficult in our culture to get people to listen to that. Okay, although Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all come from the same Abrahamic roots, okay, and have an awful lot in common. So, views about reality, views about how we ought to live, views about all kinds of things may, if not being, they don't have to be identical. They have to be composable. If we're going to live in the same world, if we're going to work together, if we're going to share knowledge, we're going to share institutions, we need composability. We don't have to homogenize our beliefs. We don't have to homogenize our approach to life. What we need is to find ways of making it composable. And one way to make it composable is not to cling on to personal experience. I mean, it's fine to use personal experience, but remember, you didn't live every person's life. Not to cling on to personal experience or personal circumstances or tradition or whatever. Recently read someone said, tradition is just giving into peer pressure for a bunch of dead people. Which, okay, that's a little one-sided, but funny, and it does embody what is wrong about simply appealing to tradition and appealing to your own experience. It's like appealing to your personal circumstances as if you are the center of the world. Philosophy, various people, it's been attributed to Aristotle and to Plato and to various other people. Philosophy begins in wonder. Approach the world, approach one another with a sense of wonder, and you'll get farther than if you say, well, I'm going to approach this only with the assumption that I probably already pretty much know what I need to know. Okay? As someone once said, I think I've seen it misattributed to Mark Twain. I'm pretty sure he didn't originally say it. If ignorance were bliss, the world would be filled with deliriously happy people. Much to be said for that. Much of what we don't know does hurt us. And there is no one person whose experience is so definitive, or one group of people, or one culture, or one historical epoch whose experience is so definitive that you need to look no further. Okay, I'm really looking forward to working with this group because there's so much vigorous, intelligent, and forthright discussion that's been going on. So thank you very much.